Good evening, everybody. This is Don Smith. I am a writer. I am also a reporter, and I also, when I have the opportunity to do it, I am an interviewer. And tonight I am hanging out with my good friend, Robert Schneck, the author of The President's Vampire, which became The Bye-Bye Man, which was turned into a movie which featured Doug Jones as the Bye-Bye Man. And Robert, thank you so much for being a part of this.
It's my pleasure, Don.
Well, since we're doing this kind of podcast, we're talking horror movies, and you've also had experience with seeing one of your books turned into a horror movie. You and I have had long conversations about horror movies and stuff like this, and I wanted to ask you, what are some of your favorite horror movies? And I was wondering if we could go through each one, kind of talk about it for a little bit, and we'll just share this with everybody and see what other people out there think. Let them comment in on the YouTube page, Facebook, wherever they see this. Mm-hmm. So, and you were kind enough to agree to this, so this is awesome. Okay, so let's start with your. Well, let me first ask. Are you doing this by which ones you like the best, or are these just random order?
I'm doing this in random order, and actually I spent 2 days trying to figure out what my favorite horror movies were, because like anything that unimportant, you spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. It's like, well, is it the 5 I think are best? Is it the 5 I've watched the most? Is it the 5 that I think have had the biggest impact on me? Or is it the 5 I just plain enjoy the most? And I couldn't think of 5, but I did come up with 4.
Okay.
And a lot of alternates.
Okay.
For 5.
Okay, that works. All right, so let's start with, I guess, what is the first one that comes to mind for you?
The first one is a strange, offbeat, very cheap horror movie. I can't remember the year it was made, but it was called Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. It is a occult / hippie cult / zombie movie that was made down in Florida on a budget of about $9. And I have had a bizarre fascination with this movie ever since I saw it on Channel 9 when I was a little kid on a Saturday morning. What it was doing being shown on a Saturday morning, I don't know, because it's a grim movie, and it's got the most effective zombie resurrection scene I've ever seen in any horror movie.
Interesting. So is it like, are we talking like zombies, like what you see with the George Romero Walking Dead stuff, or are we talking one zombie giving everybody a hard time type of thing? It was
a little bit of the black magic, but I mean, obviously it's based on Night of the Living Dead, but the story, very briefly, is this theater group. This theater group is run by this little monster of a guy called Alan, who's just awful. And he brings them to this island that's used for it's like a potter's field. The city buries its criminals and for tramps and people who die they don't know what to do with, and they bury them on this island. So he takes his little theatrical troupe, which he's a tyrant over, and brings them out to this island and performs a black magic ritual to bring the zombies, to bring the corpses on the island to life. And he performs the ritual, it doesn't work, and then it turns out that it did work. And while he brings one of the corpses back to this house that's owned by the caretaker on the island, and he's insulting it and fooling with it and mocking it. And while he's making fun of this corpse, the other corpses rise up out of the cemetery and attack the whole group. I honestly have a hard time recommending the movie to other people because it's very slow, and nothing happens really for the first hour except people being awful to each other. The acting is okay, for a movie like that, it's okay. But I have this bizarre fascination with it. I don't know why exactly. It just really works for me.
Is it one of these things where, like, a lot of times it's who you're with, like, the mood that you were in, whatever it was? Because a lot of times, like, if you rewatch a movie and over again, no matter how good it is or no matter how bad it was, I just remember this was just a good experience for me when it occurred, or I was having just an okay day and it was just kind of like, maybe this was unusual to see something like this on a Saturday morning, and you've always been drawn to such unusual things. Could it be something along those lines as to why you keep coming back to this?
Well, it was probably the first zombie movie, the first of the Romero-type zombie movies that I ever saw, because when I was a kid, they were not available. It's not like you could rent a video or go to Netflix. Those films just were not available.
Right.
And I wouldn't have been allowed to see them even if they were. How something as gruesome as Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things ended up being shown on a Saturday morning on television is beyond me.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, let's jump into your next one.
Okay. The next one would be Theater of Blood.
That's a great title.
Yeah, it's a great movie. It's, I think it's Vincent Price's best movie, and I am a big Vincent Price fan. It's very simple. This actor, he's a Shakespearean actor named Edward Lionheart, who is a gigantic ham actor. But he loves Shakespeare, and every year he puts on a whole season of Shakespearean plays, and the critics despise him. They mock him. They never give him awards. They never even give him good reviews. So one day he's had enough, and the critics are all having their annual critics dinner, and he shows up and he gives the to be or not to be speech, and he jumps off the balcony of the building into the River Thames. Everyone thinks he's dead, but he's not. He survives, and he comes back, and one by one he starts to kill the critics in ways that people get killed in Shakespeare's plays.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so one gets drowned in a barrel of wine like the Duke of Clarence and Richard III. Let me see. Where do they get some of this? Oh, the female critic Vincent Price met her on during this film, and he ended up marrying her. He electrocutes her while she's getting her hair done. He hooks up her hairdo equipment to electricity.
That's awesome.
And that is supposed to be the equivalent of Joan of Arc being burned at the stake. I forget the Shakespeare play where that happens. But there's one critic is almost killed in a sword fight from Romeo and Juliet. One critic has a pound of flesh cut out of his body from Merchant of Venice, and so on and so on. And it is just a terrific film. It's got some of the best British talent, not to mention Vincent Price.
Of course.
Oh, and Robert Morley is in it. Robert Morley has the absolute best death in the entire movie. The whole thing is, to my mind, that's just one of the great scenes of all horror movies. And Vincent Price is perfect. I can't imagine anyone else playing this role. Nobody's big enough. No one is... All right, they say hammy, I say big. He was the only one who could really, really pull it off. And, it's got Diane Rigg in it, and a bunch of other very famous, very familiar British actors and actresses.
Right. I got two things that come to mind when you say that. One, the plot almost reminds me of The Crow with Brandon Lee. I don't know if
I never saw.
Which is a really great movie. It's basically, I mean, granted, he's actually killed, but his spirit comes back because a crow brings his spirit from the land of the dead back, brings him back to life, and he goes around and he offs every one of the people that killed him and his fiancée. But I'm not a fan of remakes. If they were to do a remake, I could see John Lithgow playing that.
Playing the Crow?
The Theater of Blood.
Yeah, well, that's because he's got that same quality of bigness when he wants to do it. Also, physically, he's as large as Vincent Price was.
Yeah.
And I think that plays a part. Also, keep in mind, Theater of Blood is a completely non-supernatural horror movie. It's a revenge horror movie.
Yeah.
And, it's one of those things where I can't imagine anyone else doing it, but I'd certainly be willing to give it a try. It's funny, too, because the movie was made to cash in on Vincent Price's Dr. Phibes movies, which had come out before that. And they're the same essential plot.
Right.
Dr. Phibes and his wife are in an auto accident, and 8 or 9 doctors, I forget, fail to save Phibes' wife, so he decides to kill them using the biblical plagues as a source for the idea of how to kill them.
Right.
So one is killed by frogs. He has a frog mask put on his head that squashes his head, so on. It goes on like that. And again, Theater of Blood was meant to be a cheap cash-in on that, but I think it's a far superior movie. Part of it is that they just let these actors do their thing, and they didn't get in the way.
Right.
So, Vincent Price and Robert Morley, all these people, they just fill the screen.
Right.
And it's enough. It really is. The thing's got holes in it. It's got a lot of problems, but who cares?
Do you remember the first time you saw it?
No, I don't. It must have been on television, and I probably watched it because it had Vincent Price in it.
Right.
And it wouldn't even surprise me if I didn't like it that much, because it didn't have monsters or vampires or werewolves in it. But over time, it certainly moved to the... It certainly moved up on my list,
right? Until
finally it reached until it reached the top,
right? Okay. Okay. All right. So let's talk about your next one. What is next on the list? So let's do a quick review. We have got Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things and The Theater of Blood. What is on your third?
The next one is Return of the Living Dead, which is another zombie movie, and it was made in the 1980s. It stars, what's his name? I forget his first name. The guy Karen, the one who did
yeah, he was in the Pathmark commercials.
The Pathmark commercial. I couldn't think of it. Yeah, he's one of the stars of it. He's terrific.
Actually, I'm going to correct you.
Jason?
No. It was Return of the Living Dead Part 2. He was in that one.
No, he's in the first one too.
Is he playing different people then?
I don't know.
Is he a grave robber?
No. He's a he is the guy who is in charge of he works for a man who owns a medical supply warehouse, who's played by Clu Gulager, and he more or less runs the supply house while this guy owns it.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt real quick. He was in the second version of that, but playing another character.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Okay. In fact, so was
Mr. Karen, I mean.
Yeah. So was the guy who was working for him, Tom. His last name goes right out of my head. I know he spells it Thom. Tom.
Okay.
An actor. Anyway, so they're working in this warehouse, and a bunch of Tom's friends show up, and they are what back in the 1980s was considered punk, and they're actually kind of goth. I think we'd call them kind of goth right now. They end up having a party in the cemetery while they're waiting for him to get out of work. And while the two of the men who work in the warehouse, they start talking about the weirdest thing they ever saw, because it's such a strange warehouse. I mean, it's got skeletons and split dogs that are used by veterinary schools, and lots of artificial limbs. So James Karen takes them down into the cellar, and it turns out that they have these barrels full of corpses that supposedly came to life. And while he's he's cleaning off one of the barrels. He slaps the thing on the side to show him how sturdy it is, and this steam comes out. This poisonous gas comes out, and with that, the dead start to come to life. They have to. This one corpse that they have in storage for the medical supply house comes to life, attacks everyone. They chop it up. They burn it up at the funeral home next door, which happens to have a crematorium, and it starts to rain, and the rain brings the poison into the cemetery, and all of those corpses come to life.
Oh, wow.
And they spend the night being terrorized by these corpses, which are different. They're not typical Romero corpses. They run, they talk, they've got a degree of intelligence, they can be cunning. It's an awfully fun movie, and it was just
kind of a comedy, right?
It is a comedy. It's a horror comedy. All of the three that I've mentioned have strong comic elements. Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things is a very dark comedy. Theater of Blood is a dark comedy. This is a dark comedy. Although it's just, at some points, it's just out-and-out comedy.
Right.
It's a fun movie. I mean, and it's got weird little things in it. For example, the funeral director, his name is Ernie Kaltenbrunner, which, if you don't know it, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was a very important figure in Nazi Germany. And when we first meet Ernie Kaltenbrunner, he's listening to what sound like Nazi marches on headsets.
Oh, gosh.
And if you look very closely at the bulletin board in back of him, I think there's a picture of Himmler hanging on hanging on this bulletin board behind him. He's obviously really into Nazis.
Right.
In fact, he puts on this raincoat that I'm pretty sure is an SS or a Nazi raincoat at one point in the movie.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And he's got a Luger.
Right. I will jump in, because what was funny about the second part is, in the second part of Return of the Living Dead Part 2, you actually see a scene where a bunch of zombies are getting electrocuted, and one really skinny one comes in with like this red leather coat with pointed shoulders and curly dark hair, and he's got a single glove, and he's dancing, and the implication is that it was Michael Jackson.
Does his hair catch on fire?
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know. So, but it's interesting that there is this element of comedy in a lot of these things, because even to some extent I would say that Jason X went from being something that, like, oh my gosh, this scared me, like the movie series Friday the 13th went from being something very scary to becoming something very comical. Because, like, if you saw Jason X, that was a horror comedy. There's no way around it. That had to have been a horror comedy.
Oh, it was. In fact, it had one of my favorite scenes from any Jason movie, and that's when those two holograph girls are saying, "We love premarital sex and smoking weed," and they just start jumping up and down topless, and Jason just puts them both in a sleeping bag and starts whacking them against a tree. It's just it really is a funny scene. But it is not unusual for horror movies to make that transition for a horror franchise. I mean, look at the Universal horror movies; they ended up with Abbott and Costello.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But then what happens? So the Universal horror movies are made; they run for maybe, 10 years, and then the Abbott and Costello movies are made, and a bunch of other horror comedies were made. I think even with the same actors. I mean, Lugosi and Karloff, and Vincent Price shows up in one of them, and Lon Chaney, I think, is in one of them, and they have a good time with it. I actually think Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is a pretty good film.
Yeah.
But again, it's run its course. So then you wait a few years, and then Hammer comes out, and Hammer starts remaking them again very seriously, but with a lot of fun elements, a lot of sex and blood, that in color movies, and that they just couldn't. They couldn't even begin to get away with when the original Universal horror movies were made. So they added new elements, and they brought the series back to life. It's really wonderful the way horror reinvents itself that way. Except for things like sparkly vampires, which are just an obscenity.
Yeah. Now, just kind of as we're going down this rabbit trail real quick, are you of the opinion that there's about 1,000 Dracula movies, okay? But why is it people only want Robert Englund to play Freddy Krueger? Why couldn't we have other people playing Freddy Krueger? Or is it because he's still with us type of thing? What is it about like, say, these modern horror icons, like your Jasons, your Michael Myers, your Freddy Kruegers? Why is it that only maybe one person can play them? Specifically Jason, such as Kane Hodder, Robert Englund as Freddy.
I think Robert Englund as Freddy is an unusual. He's sort of the exception to them, because Freddy was not silent the way Jason and Michael Myers are, and Leatherface is. He spoke. He had a definite voice and a definite personality, even a definite body language, all of which Robert Englund invented. So it would be natural to see him always in that part. As opposed to Jason, where, yes, Kane Hodder is identified with the role, but he didn't originate it, and other actors besides him played it.
Right. And
he was very smart to get so identified with it, because it was a good career move for him.
Right.
And but to my mind, he also did a very good job with it. But it doesn't have to be Kane Hodder, and certainly with Michael Myers, I don't even remember the name of the actor who played Michael Myers.
Right.
They're a different kind of role. When Boris Karloff stopped playing the Frankenstein monster, I don't think anyone said, "Oh my gosh, I'm not going to watch it if Glenn Strange plays it," because again, it was a non-speaking role that had a lot of makeup involved.
Right.
Someone like Bela Lugosi, the only makeup he had was he slicked his hair back, as far as I know. I'm sure they used some powder on his face. But other than that, it was Bela Lugosi.
Right. But, see, the thing is though, but if someone says we're going to do a new Dracula movie, that's fine. But if someone says we're going to do a new Friday the 13th movie, it's, come on, can't you leave well enough alone? What is the difference between the two attitudes?
Well, I think part of it is that Friday the 13th is very formulaic, and it is, and I'm not criticizing it. I love the formulas, but it's essentially, there is no real reason to keep doing it over and over again. It's not like you're going to uncover new meanings.
Right.
It's not like this is, it's like with Dracula, there are so many perspectives. There's, because of partly the way it's written, there's Lucy's perspective and Harker's perspective and Van Helsing's perspective and all of these other people who were involved. It's did it really happen the way they thought it happened? Was it a dream? Was what are the sexual undertones to this? What's the meaning to that? What about religion? All that. You can get into all of that stuff with Dracula, and Dracula's kind of a pulp novel. It is.
Right.
But there's still all of these levels of what is living, what is death, what is what's in between them, love, all that stuff. And you're not going to find that in Friday the 13th.
Right.
Part of that is also the fact, I mean, you have to think of where Friday the 13th came from. I mean, Sean Cunningham made porno movies. So what have we got? We've essentially got, instead of people having sex, it's people having sex and getting murdered. Mm-hmm. There's not a whole lot to talk about.
Right.
And also, since Dracula started out as a book, it's always going to have a lot more layers than something that started out as a simple entertainment to make a profitable film.
Right. Okay, because that's what it was. The original one was, and I'm not going to spoil anything, was the mother was going around killing teenagers because they let her son die years ago, and there was no intention of making a second movie. And then all of a sudden somebody says, people loved it, let's come up with a second one. And that basically led to, okay, now we're going to get a third, then a fourth, and a fifth, and so on. And whereas with Dracula, it was, as you said, there are so many layers that you can do to this.
Oh, it's political, it's religious, it never ends.
Right. Cool. All right, that was a cool rabbit trail to go down. All right, so, so one more time. Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, Theater of Blood, Return of the Living Dead.
One thing you didn't ask me was where I first saw that.
Oh, where did you first see that?
And that was a very 80s way of seeing a horror movie at the time. I was in high school, and some friends and I went over to the video store, and we rented it along with some other movies, and we sat in my friend's basement and we watched horror movies that night.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was, like I said, it was a very 80s, and we probably went to the arcade too. And then we probably went to the diner to talk about the horror movie. That would have been the normal for the 80s.
Right.
And it was just a lot of fun, and I remember truly enjoying the movie at the time. It was just funny and enjoyable, and it always stuck with me. It's funny too, because from the little bit I've read, that movie was the actual making of that movie was terrible for everyone involved. They hated it.
Right.
But none of that comes out on screen.
Right. Oh, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true. It's just something I came across once.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about what's your next favorite one, your fourth one.
The next one is the one you're going to have a big problem with, which is The Shining. Now, The Shining is also the only one in my group that's a big budget movie.
Right.
It's the only one that has an
elevator filled with blood.
And it has an elevator filled with blood, and it's got it comes from a major book. The other ones obviously didn't. It had an enormously famous director who made it, an enormously famous writer who wrote it. It really belongs to the mainstream. The others were kind of, if you're into horror, you're into those, those things. If you're into horror comedy, especially, The Shining is one of the few that is an exception to that, and part of that is, I personally find The Shining very funny. I know a lot of people don't. I think it's a very funny film. It's not funny in the conventional way, but I think that Kubrick is having us on a lot, and it's just, for me, it is such a different experience to see a film with incredible cinematography, to see a film with a big budget, to see a film with big stars and things like that. It's an unusual experience for me. It's unusual for me to know who directed a movie.
Right.
Because most of the time, I know a half dozen horror directors, but I can't tell you. I think Bob Clark directed Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, and of course he went on to make Porky's and a bunch of other things.
I think he even did A Christmas Story.
He did. He actually became incredibly famous.
Oh yeah, he also did directed my favorite Sherlock Holmes movie.
Oh really?
Yeah, Murder by Decree.
Oh, for heaven's sake! You see, so you see, everything crosses eventually.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course Kevin Bacon was in
Porky's.
Friday the 13th.
That's right.
So anyway.
Oh no, I was mixing that up with Animal House.
That's right. Yeah, okay. I think it's around the same time. But the odd thing about The Shining is The Shining does a lot of things that I like, which is it makes the horror... It creates a self-contained world for the horror to take place.
Right.
The Overlook Hotel, they're snowed in. That's it. It's like a little bit like the island in Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. They're on this island. They're with these. They're again in this little self-contained world, or in Return of the Living Dead, they're in this funeral home, they're surrounded by the dead. It's these little self-contained worlds where horrible things happen. And The Shining is probably also the only one that most people consider a serious horror movie.
Right.
But again, I personally find it very funny. I think the idea of meeting an evil ghost in the hotel toilet is just a riot. I thought that whole scene with Lloyd the bartender, I just find it very funny. And the whole thing with the Shelley Duvall losing her mind.
Yeah.
Dick Halloran giving Danny that long talk about The Shining in the kitchen. And while he's giving Danny this talk, you look over to the wall and there's this set of knives hanging over Danny's head in the background. It's just little stuff like that happens all the time. For example, there's one scene. This is the thing about Kubrick, and I know you don't like him, that's fine. But Kubrick really goes for those layers.
Right.
And one of the things I noticed every time I watch The Shining, I find something new that he did. For example, the little boy, what was his name again? Danny.
Yeah.
Danny, his imaginary
Red
psychic
Rum.
friend is Tony.
Right.
So there's this one scene where Jack Nicholson has been knocked down by his wife and put into the food locker. Mm-hmm. And I think he's talking to her, saying things about how, oh, I'm hurt bad, won't you let me out, all that stuff. If you look very closely in the background, Shelley Duvall is listening to him. You'll see a little Tony the Tiger box of cereal in the background. So Tony's listening. And of course, Tony is Danny's psychic friend.
Right.
So it's like weird little stuff like that goes on in these Kubrick movies that makes watching them over and over again fun. I don't believe any of the stuff that people go on about how it's a secret code for Kubrick revealing that he shot the moon landing.
Okay.
I don't believe that it's a parable for the Holocaust. I don't believe that it's a parable for the destruction of the American Indian. I don't believe any of that stuff. I think it's a horror movie.
Right.
And I think Kubrick thought of it that way. And if he threw little things in there, he probably did it to amuse himself, or he thought it would add a little something to the film.
Right. Now, for people that are listening, Robert and I have had very long conversations about The Shining, and I'm going to simply say I am not a fan of the movie. I happen to think it's a comedy, but for different reasons. I mean, whenever I think of The Shining, I always think of Jack Nicholson at the end of it with his lower jaw jutting forward out. And what it reminds me of is that old TV series, Scrubs, where the janitor is talking about one of his family members walking around, and he goes, he used to tuck around like this and go, hey, what you doing, with his jaw sticking out like that. And he kind of has this sling blade thing going for him, like, I want me some French fried potatoes. And that's what it reminds me of. And so when I see him sitting there just frozen like that, I think, I need me some French fried potatoes right now. And
but again, Don, if you go into this thinking to yourself, this is a very strange comedy, a lot of the movie makes sense.
Right.
I mean, when Jack Nicholson is lured into the bathroom by that naked woman and she turns into this hideous old crone, that's a nasty practical joke.
Yeah.
I mean, that is what's happening. It is a nasty joke.
Well, I still just can't get my head around the flood of blood that just comes running around. Because what goes through my head is, how many people did this hotel have to kill to get all that blood? Where is it storing that blood? How is that supposed to be scary?
Well, I think what Kubrick did, what Kubrick did was he tried to tell the story economically. Okay. So rather than show us show us a flashback of somebody getting shot, and then a flashback of somebody getting strangled, and a flashback of somebody being killed with an axe, and so on and so on and so on, we get an elevator full of blood. That's right. Just his way of saying, in one shot, this place has an incredibly bloody history. Okay. And for another thing, for example, the scene where the man in the tuxedo and the guy in the dog costume, that is a way for him to sum up saying this hotel not only has a violent history, it has a decadent history. Right. So, some very strange things happened here. Again, I think it's economy in storytelling, and it's just a time saver. And also, the other way of doing it is so predictable. Right. I mean, when Stephen King made his version of The Shining, he more or less did it as like the book. And yeah, you get all those flashbacks, and okay, this one was killed then, and this one was killed here. Right. But instead, elevator full of blood. This place had an astonishingly bloody history. End of discussion. Right. Now I can understand it, because the big thing that Stephen King, I think, was annoyed with the portrayal of it was the portrayal of Jack Torrance. How he went from being someone that was overcome by his demons to then being somebody that was attempting to kill his wife and son. And in the book, Jack Torrance, he does become overwhelmed by his demons, and yes, he does become a danger to his wife and son, but ultimately, he sacrifices himself by destroying the furnace that blows up the hotel in the book. Mm-hmm. And King, here he was as a father, and he's writing The Shining, and this is a father that has basically been moving heaven and earth. Like, if you've read his book on writing, he talks about the hard times he had after him and his wife were married and having like 2-3 kids, and his kid would get sick and they wouldn't have the money for the liquid antibiotics that they needed for it, and he's writing this as a father, like he's basically putting himself as a father. And I think his ultimate annoyance, and I don't want to put words in Stephen King's mouth, but I think his annoyance with the Stanley Kubrick film was there was no redemption of the Jack Nicholson character. No, absolutely not. In fact, it's the opposite. Right. He betrays his family to join the hotel. Right. And I think if ultimately I think Stephen King would have been okay with the Kubrick version, and again, forgive me if I'm putting words in his mouth, if it had ended with Nicholson sacrificing himself to destroy the hotel. Right. And that's not the kind of storyteller Kubrick is, though. Right. I would say that Kubrick has a far less sentimental streak, and he's not a sentimentalist the way Stephen King is, which is one of the reasons why Stephen King is so enormously popular, and why Stanley Kubrick is very popular among a certain kind of person. Yeah. He's not a popularist. He's not a populist, I guess is the right word. Stephen King is very much, as he goes out of his way to tell us at every opportunity, he's an ordinary guy. Yeah. He's an ordinary guy who's also the most popular novelist in history and is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Right. But his basic persona is ordinary guy. Stanley Kubrick never pretended to be an ordinary guy. He has very different goal in his storytelling. Right. And The Shining, to tell you the truth, is really the only Stanley Kubrick movie I really like. I've watched the other ones. I find them kind of off-putting. I don't find The Shining off-putting. I find it very comfortable and very... I don't know, I feel very comfortable at the Overlook Hotel. Right, right. Once the snow falls and were cut off for good, I feel just like I kind of understand why Jack gives in to the hotel.
Right.
After all, his family isn't that much. He doesn't much like his wife. He certainly doesn't much like his kid. He likes the hotel a lot.
Yeah.
And he's a writer, and God knows, when you've done writing for a while, you kind of begin to understand the resentment that you can feel for family. Anyone who's ever written knows that, gosh, when you're trying to write and you've got to hear about little Danny's cough or how we're running out of toilet paper, so would you please stop writing that very important passage and go buy toilet paper, it can annoy you.
Yeah.
So I think that Stanley Kubrick is talking about some very real things in this movie that have nothing to do with Indian massacres and other stuff, but have to do with the life of the artist.
Right.
And that is not what Stephen King is ever talking about. Stephen King is talking about family redemption, sentimentality, blah, 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 blah. Again, that's something that a lot of people can relate to, which is one of the reasons he is so enormously, unbelievably popular.
Right. Now, I will say, just on a completely different note, I've always been of the opinion that that one scene where you see him chopping down the door and Nicholson comes through and he goes, "Here's Johnny," that was always, that image right there is probably what got Tim Burton to make him the Joker in the 1989 Batman movie. Because the thing is that the Nicholson of 1977 versus the Nicholson of 1989, there's about 12 to 15 years in between there. And Nicholson in that time got a little heavier. His hairline was receding and stuff. And I gotta tell you, if they had somehow or another could have pulled it together to make Batman in 1978 or something, Nicholson would have been, like, he was good in 89, but I think he would have been downright perfect if they had gotten him in 78. Like, the Nicholson of that Nicholson would have been absolutely fascinating to see that incarnation of Nicholson if you could have brought him forward to 1989 and let that play the Joker. That would have been interesting. So, okay, let's kind of come to, obviously we've been talking for a while now. You said had some honorable mentions. Why don't we go over them very briefly?
Okay.
Actually, you know what? I forgot to ask you. First time you saw The Shining.
I was bored to death. I couldn't understand why anyone liked this movie. I thought it was dull. I simply found it completely uninteresting. I have no idea what changed. I just happened to be, I just out of curiosity happened to watch it again one night, and I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. Also, I like the music. And as time went on, I realized that there's stuff here. It felt like the first time I watched it, I just didn't bother with it. It was just so different than what I was used to.
Right.
I mean, I like zombies. I like people that are, fighting hordes of this or that. That's generally what I like. But for some reason, this sneaked into my consciousness and took hold.
Very cool. Very cool. All right, so let's go over some of your honorable mentions.
Okay, honorable mentions. They include House of Wax with Vincent Price.
Of course.
A movie that was shot in 3D, which makes some of these scenes very strange when you watch it on television. I also have a bunch of movies that I honestly can't say are good, but are like, they're like a warm armchair or a warm bath or a comfortable armchair for me. I'll just put them on and let them play while I'm doing my work, and I've probably listened or watched them countless times, and they include a bunch of bad 70s movies: Prophecy, Grizzly, and Snow Beast, all of which are essential. Well, Prophecy and Snow Beast and Grizzly are both Jaws on land. One of them involves a Bigfoot and the other involves a bear. Prophecy was an eco-horror film from either the early 80s or the late 70s. Again, and Snow Beast was made for TV, so it's not particularly bloody, and yet to this day there's still something about it that creeps me out. Now, a lot of people, listening to this might say, oh, he only likes old movies. But I actually like some of the new movies, too. I loved Train to Busan, the Korean zombie movie. I thought it was a terrific film. It was too long, but, non-American films tend to be too long. And I loved the movie Exists, which was a Bigfoot movie made by the guy who made Blair Witch Project. But the characters are so repulsive, and the constant swearing I find just repellent. And yet it had one of the only scenes in a horror movie that actually scared me. I can't think of another film that gave me the creeps as much as that film did.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a scene where a guy's on a bicycle being chased by a Bigfoot. It scares the crap out of me. But again, I just find the nonstop swearing repulsive. And probably the film I've seen the most is Dawn of the Dead, because back in the days when a videotape cost $50 or $60,
yeah,
I owned Dawn of the Dead. I owned Romero's Dawn of the Dead. I owned Martin, which is a great underrated film, and I owned The Legend of Boggy Creek. I owned all three of those.
Oh, interesting.
And consequently, I watched each one of them about 100 times. I would just put them on the VCR and let them play while I was writing. And I know every line practically from Dawn of the Dead. At least the version I have of it.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I do love those movies. I love all three of them. But favorites, they're not my favorites yet. And again, there's a lot of movies like that. Movies that I just really liked, and yet for some reason I would never call them a favorite, like Demon and Demons, the Italian demon movies, and a bunch of others.
Right.
But I can have no trouble picking the top four. The fifth, though, that's up for grabs.
Right. Well, you've given us a lot to check out, and you have been very awesome with your time. Also, one other thing, speaking of unusual and off-the-wall stuff, or shall I say strange stuff, check out Robert's Facebook page, Historian of the Strange, where he posts a ton of crazy, unusual articles, wacky things that have happened in America's past that he'll put out. Just really unusual stuff. Also, at the same time, check out The President's Vampire. There's an audio version available on Audible with the amazing Scott Brick doing the narration on that. And his latest book, Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist, is available. It should be available in all formats. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, we just saw it at Barnes & Noble.
Oh, he did? Okay. I would have snapped a photo of it. So, anyway, Robert, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.
And this was a lot of fun. And everybody out there, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.